stuff. He's a brilliant man, and he's such a gentle person. He's really fun to listen to. In fact, he was debating, I think it was Richard Dawkins, atheist, and the moderator said it was like watching Satan debate Santa Claus. He's just that kind of person. He never gets worked up or anything. So we're going to test you. Stephen Hawking, in his book, he made the comment, because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Does anybody see a problem with that comment? This was the premise of his entire book. Who here knows what nothing is? Aristotle said it's what rocks dream about. Nothing is nothing. The problem here is he's what they call equivocating on the word nothing. Because in his nothing, there's a law such as gravity. Gravity is something. It's not nothing. But all the science points to a beginning to all contingent things, everything that we have around us. So it all came from nothing. Well, that's not nothing. You'll hear scientists do this a lot. They'll talk about the universe popping into existence or exploding into existence from nothing, but their nothing is swirling mathematical points or quantum energy fluctuations. That's all something, okay? In response to that comment, John Lennox said this: nonsense remains nonsense even when talked by world-famous scientists. So just because it comes out of the mouth of a brilliant person doesn't automatically make it true. And they confuse a lot of people when they talk about nothing. Equivocating, if you don't know, equivocating on a word is when you use the same word, but you use it in two different meanings within your conversation. So just like bark can mean the bark on a tree or the sound a dog makes, they're using nothing as meaning nothing and as meaning gravity or fluctuating energy levels. So things to pay attention to. So tonight, does God exist? We're going to talk about the teleological argument, the divine design. Excuse me. I'm going to grab my water real quick. As we mentioned previously, there are three primary arguments. There's a lot of arguments for the existence of God, but there are three primary ones. The one is from the beginning of the universe, which we talked about last week, was the cosmological argument. Tonight we're going to talk about the teleological argument. And the teleological argument, the word comes from telos, the Greek word telos, which just means having an end or a goal or a purpose. So what the teleological argument is stating is that there's a specific purpose that is shown both in the universe and biology, and that specific purpose is life. We'll see that the universe, all the way from its beginning to its current status, it's very fine-tuned for life. This is William Paley. He's an old-timer. And he's famous. He was a theologian and apologist, and he is most famous for what is called the watchmaker argument. And his argument was, if you were walking through the woods and you stumbled upon a watch laying on the ground. Now, I chose a Rolex. I don't think he had Rolexes in his day. But if that happened to you and you found that watch on the ground, what would you infer about that watch? Would you think that it just came about by natural processes? Right. Someone dropped it, somebody lost it, you better be looking for the owner. And we infer design intuitively. We don't have to think about it. We just know when we see something that is designed, we recognize it as designed. This is William Dembski, who's a Christian mathematician and philosopher, and he took Paley's argument and he said, okay, what is it when we see that watch, even though we just intuitively notice it's designed, what specifically is it about that watch that makes us recognize that design? And he coined the term, he wrote the book, The Design Inference, and he coined the term specified complexity. And we recognize this, it's not just the complexity of a thing and the improbability of those parts being put together in a specific order, but it has to have some type of functionality or an end goal or a purpose. So it's not just the fact that that watch has interlocking parts and gears and hands and the spindle to set the watch. It's just that we know that when we see something that has an end goal or purpose, we recognize it as a design. And we know because it's design, there must be a designer. Atheist evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins, he disagrees. He actually wrote a book called The Blind Watchmaker, which was a play on Paley's watchmaker argument. And what Dawkins is saying is, you may see what you think is design, but it's actually illusory. It's an illusion. And what is his explanation for what looks like design is the evolutionary process, which is blind and undirected. It just does what it does based on environmental pressures on a species, but there's no mind behind evolution. But what he said two things. This is about the universe. He said, the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Now, this is a very honest, you got to give it to him, it's an honest declaration of the atheist position. And he recognizes that because he's saying, at bottom, there's no design, no purpose, no evil, no good. The atheist worldview, you're stuck with what's called nihilism or nihilism, meaning you can't have purpose. There can't be good and evil. We'll talk about that when we get to the moral argument. There's no such thing as evil or good in an atheistic moral or atheistic worldview. It's just opinion. Because who determines good and evil is the individual, and there's nothing outside of that individual or group of individuals, if you want to talk about a country. So there is no higher authority, so who's deciding? So morality, if you want to call it morality, completely turns from an objective morality to an internal subjective morality. So I'm getting off the point. He also said about biology that it is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. They recognize the design. In fact, in some places, they talk about it being overwhelming. I think it was Francis Crick, who was part of the Crick and Watson team that elucidated the shape of the DNA molecule. He said that he would tell his students and stuff to be careful because what you think you see as design is not actually design. It's just evolution giving the appearance of design. That's fascinating to me. They see it. If it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, maybe it's a duck. So we have two fundamental origin questions. What caused the universe and what caused life? Next week we will get to the origin of life and the problems there. Tonight we're going to focus on what caused the universe. I think most of you here were around in April of 1970 when the whole Apollo 13 disaster happened. I was very young, but I was around. If you remember, about 55 minutes, it was a mission to walk on the moon, and about 55 hours into their mission, they heard a loud bang. And they weren't sure what it was, and hence comes the famous, Houston, we have a problem. They said, we heard a loud bang, our instrument panel is going crazy, we're not sure what's happening. When they looked out the little portal, they could see gas escaping out of their command module into the atmosphere, not atmosphere, into space. And they didn't realize it at the time, but their oxygen tank 2 had exploded and damaged oxygen tank 1. So they were in trouble. So immediately the mission was no longer walk on the moon, it was how do we get home as quickly as possible. They still had to slingshot around the moon, so they couldn't just turn around and go back like we would if we was driving to Dayton. So they had to use the moon's gravitational orbit to slingshot them back home. So they had to conserve energy, oxygen, so they shut down the command module. They jump into the lunar module because it was smaller, and then they could shut down all the life-preserving support of the command module. The problem was the lunar module was only made for 2 men, and they had to put all 3 of them in there temporarily until they got to where they were ready to enter the Earth's atmosphere. Well, what that command module is, it's designed to sustain human life. And everything in that command module has to be just right. And they started to realize that as soon as you start turning dials of oxygen and CO2, you're going to have problems. Because they put 3 people in that little lunar module, and the filtration system to filter out the CO2 that they were exhaling, it wasn't made for 3 people. So they had a problem where the CO2 was building up, and they had to concoct makeshift filters from what they could find to put on to enhance the CO2 filtration. The good news, they made it home, safe and sound. They weren't even sure that when they were coming in at about 300 miles an hour in the command module back home, they didn't even know if the parachutes were going to deploy because they didn't know how much damage was done. So that's what we call, when we're referring to the universe and Earth, it's referred to the anthropic principle. Anthropos in the Greek just means human or man. And the idea is there are principles of physics, chemistry, biology, the universe force constants. There's 4 fundamental forces in the universe. They all have to be dialed in extremely precisely for there to be life on Earth. And we'll go through that. It really is God's fingerprints all over the universe. You'll hear it often referred to as the fine-tuning argument because everything is very fine-tuned to support life. This is Sir Fred Hoyle. He's an atheist astronomer. I think he's passed away now. I'm not completely sure. In his heyday in the 50s, he made this comment. Religion is but a desperate attempt to find an escape from the truly dreadful situation in which we find ourselves. No wonder then that many people feel the need for some belief that gives them a sense of security. And no wonder that they become very angry with people like me who say that this is illusory. So he was very staunch in his atheism. In 1981, he had a change of mind. And he said, a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. Now, I don't know if he ever became a Christian. I don't think he did, unfortunately. But this is a pretty big step for an atheist, especially a scientist. So what did he learn that made him have such a 180 on the idea of whether there's a mind behind the universe or not? I will do my best at this. I'm tired. What he found, he knew that carbon, the carbon atom, is essential for life. It's the only element that we know of that is life-based. Carbon is life-based. Without carbon, you cannot have life. They've done experiments with silicon, but there are a lot of problems with silicon, so they don't think as of today that there's any way that we could have life without carbon. The problem he saw was carbon was abundant in today's world. In the early universe, we had only lighter elements such as helium and hydrogen. Helium and hydrogen are still abundant in our universe and in our world, but at that time, carbon was not. It's a heavier element. So he tried to figure out, okay, how did we get from the lighter elements to the heavier elements? And he figured it was just an evolutionary process where you take helium, which has 2 neutrons and 2 protons, and you just progressively add protons and neutrons until you get the heavier elements, such as carbon. The problem is they found what they call a 5-nucleon crevice, which means that when you get up to that number of 5, the molecule just falls apart as fast as it comes together. In fact, it has a half-life, which just means how fast it degrades, of 1/1,000,000,000 of a trillionth of a second. That's extremely fast. So the problem is you can't make carbon by just adding those neutrons and protons. So long story short, he realized carbon is also, the source of carbon is our stars. The nuclear fusion that happens in stars is what actually creates the carbon. So in order to jump that crevice, you have to start with 2 molecules, and for him it was beryllium and helium. And he showed mathematically how that could happen. Those 2 can come together, jump that crevice, and form carbon. But in order for that to happen, there's a slew of forces that need to be precise for that to happen. So I'll read this short thing. The strengths of the strong nuclear and electromagnetic forces, the ratio between all the other fundamental forces, the exact kinetic energy of beryllium and helium, and thus the strength of gravitational forces inside the stars, as well as the excitation energy of carbon, all had to be exquisitely tuned and coordinated within very narrow tolerances to promote the synthesis of large amounts of carbon inside stars. Yet without carbon, life would be impossible. So when we had the Big Bang, this thing was not a haphazard explosion. It happened very precisely, and scientists are realizing this. So we had extreme precision at the beginning of the universe. In fact, if the expansion rate of the universe was different by 1 part in 1,000 million million, a second after the Big Bang, the universe would have collapsed back on itself if it would have been lower, or if it would have been higher by 1,000 million, it would have not formed galaxies or stars or planets. So that's astonishing. We'll have a lot of astonishing numbers tonight. Also at the beginning, if the configuration of matter and energy at the beginning of the universe had been slightly different, we would have had one of two options in the universe. We would have had a universe that was dominated by black holes, which are not life permitting, or we would have had no large structures at all. No planets, no galaxies, no stars, no. In fact, Sir Roger Penrose, who was an agnostic, and he was actually a colleague of Stephen Hawking, he calculated the chances of having a low entropy universe like ours to be 1 in 10 to the 10th power to the 123rd power. Does anybody have any ideas what those numbers mean? Okay. 10 raised to the 10 power is just 10 times 10 times 10 times 10 for 10 times. So 10 to the 10th power is a billion. So when you take a billion raised to the 123rd power, these are astronomical numbers. So 10 to the 10 is a 1 with 10 zeros behind it. So when you raise that number to 123, we don't have enough room on the page for all those zeros. Also, we have extreme precision, and there are more for the beginning of the universe. Now we're just going to talk about right now, the forces both in the universe and on Earth. The oxygen levels. Oxygen currently comprises 21% of our atmosphere. If it were 25%, just 4% more, fires would just erupt spontaneously. So you'd probably have an Earth that's charred. On the other hand, if it were only 15%, we would all suffocate. There wouldn't be enough oxygen for us to breathe. Our atmosphere is transparent, but its transparency is very dialed in also. If our atmosphere were less transparent, we would not get enough solar radiation in to operate life. If it were more transparent, we would be bombarded with solar radiation, and we'd probably have some pretty severe sunburns. In fact, you'd probably burn up. The Earth and Moon gravitational interplay is also dialed in. If that interaction were greater, the tidal effects of the oceans, the atmosphere, and the rotational period of the Earth would be too severe. And if it were less, the orbital changes would cause climatic instabilities, meaning we would have climate changes that would not support human life. CO2 levels. If they were higher, we would have a runaway greenhouse effect. If they were lower, plants would be unable to maintain efficient photosynthesis. And if you know, plants are necessary for human life because we breathe in oxygen and exhale CO2, and plants absorb CO2 and give off a byproduct of oxygen. So we can't survive without plants and trees. And also, the gravitational force, if it were altered more than 1 part in 10 to the 40th power, the sun wouldn't exist, which is necessary for us to be here, and the moon would crash into the Earth or shear off into space. Again, that's 1 with 40 zeros after it. To put that in perspective, if you were to take a tape measure and stretch it across the entire universe, granted gravity is not measured in inches, but just to give you scale, across the known universe, and you move gravitational force by 1 inch in either direction, we're not here. Anybody know where we're at in the solar system? Sun's over here, and we are the third rock from the sun. Anybody ever seen that show? So we are right here. Over here, I'm used to doing. Over here, this is Jupiter. Jupiter is the largest planet in our solar system. But to put that in perspective, here, anybody have any idea why we need Jupiter? Why that's important to Earth? If you look at you can't see it real good on here, these purple plumes on the surface of Jupiter, those are comet fragment strikes that are larger than the Earth itself. So Jupiter acts as a cosmic vacuum cleaner, which allows us to be here. Its gravitational pull is so great, it actually pulls in a lot of space debris that would wipe Earth out. So, this is Jupiter. This is us. This is all to scale. If we go further out, here's our sun. Earth is here. Poor Pluto is a pixel on the screen. In our own, this is just our galaxy. This is not moving outside of our galaxy to other galaxies or the extended universe. This is another star in our galaxy called Arcturus. And if you compare Arcturus, Jupiter is now about a pixel in size, almost invisible. Earth you can't see anymore. Then you have Antares, which is another star in our universe. Here's Arcturus, which we just looked at, and our solar system's gone. In fact, I don't even think our sun is on here anymore. Oh, yeah, it is. It's a pixel in size. Remember how large our sun was? The universe is massive. In fact, we'll pull up the Bible verse in Isaiah where God says, "Look to the heavens, that the heavens declare the glory of God." This is the closest thing we will see to what infinite is. There are about 100 billion stars just in our galaxy, and there are about 200 billion galaxies. So the number of stars they will equate it to the number of stars in the universe is probably about the same as the number of grains of sand on all the beaches in the world. And we'll get to another fact that will put that in perspective. This is a picture of the sky. I gotta quit doing that. This is a picture of the sky. This is this little tiny square blown up by the Hubble telescope. If we pick any two stars in the universe, the average distance between any two stars is 30 trillion miles between the two. And it has to be that way for life to exist. So even the distribution of all the matter in the universe is dialed in to support life. To give you some context there, the space shuttle, when it's in orbit, it travels at approximately 18,000 miles per hour, which equates to about 5 miles per second. If you were to travel between any two stars in our universe, it would take you nearly 200,000 years to get from one star to the next. Do you think we're really going to ever explore space? Never. It's that vast. But that's not all. We have the centrifugal force of the planetary movements is critical to life. The speed of light has to be dialed in exactly where it's at for life to exist. The thickness of the Earth's crust is critical. The rotation of the Earth, the axial tilt of the Earth, 23 degrees axial tilt, more or less, and we don't exist. The lightning rate, who would ever thought the lightning rate? Seismic activity. In fact, Hugh Ross said there's probably about 122 anthropic constants that all have to be what they are for us to exist. He actually calculated the probability that all 122 constants would exist as they are today for any planet in the universe. By chance alone, obviously we know it's designed, so we know why it is what it is. But in order to get there by chance, you have one chance in 10 to the 138th power. That's a 1 with 138 zeros after it. Who here has enough faith to believe that that happened by chance? To put that in perspective, there are only 10 to the 70th power atoms in the universe, in the entire universe. And we're talking about 10 to the 138. That's a big difference in number. So, we only have three options for why everything is the way it is. We can explain it by chance. All we got to do is look at the numbers, and they all interplay. That's what's fascinating to me, too. If one of those anthropic constants is altered, it affects other anthropic constants. So if you lose one, you potentially lose others, and life doesn't exist. So they all interplay, which is why that number was so large. So I don't think it happened by chance. The other option is what they call physical necessity. That's just saying the numbers had to be that way. Because of the laws of physics, they just had to be that way. The problem is we know they don't have to be that way. Those constants can have different values. Detrimental to life, but they can have different values. Or it was designed. Richard Dawkins, his popular book was called The God Delusion. And in that, he said the central argument of my book, his whole book, the central argument was the appearance of design is overwhelming. This confuses me. Is anybody else confused? They see it. It's not like they don't see it. But because their worldview starts with the presupposition God can't exist, then they don't have other choices. They know without God, if there's no mind behind the universe, it cannot be designed. However, we see all this design. So it's an illusion. Yes. But he admitted there's no explanation for it in physics. Okay, is this getting any more confusing for people? So what they revert to is the multiverse. Well, maybe it's because there are an infinite number of universes out there, and they all have different values, and we just happen to be in the lucky universe where they were all dialed in right for life. There's 4 major problems with that. I'll give you just 2. The first problem is There's no evidence. It's complete conjecture when they say there are a lot of universes out there. So it's just hypothetical. We don't have a better explanation, so maybe this is it, which relies on luck. We were just lucky. So there's no evidence for it. And secondly, if you use that reasoning, you can explain everything that happens. You can blame it on the multiverse. So why did Hitler kill 6 million Jews? We just happened to be in the unlucky universe when it came to that event. And if there are other universes, then there's probably a universe where elephants just pop into existence and makes it very unsafe driving because they just appear, just like the telephone poles everybody hits. It just appeared. I didn't even see it. And then he flips back on what John, his question, who caused God? And the who made God question, it's a category error. It just misunderstands the term God and what Christians throughout the centuries have known God to be, or our definition of who God is. It misunderstands that because it assumes that everything needs a cause. And that's not what we claim as Christians. What we claim is everything that begins to exist must have a cause. Our understanding of God is the uncaused cause, the uncreated creator. So when they ask, who made God? They're in essence, it's an incoherent question because what they're asking is, who caused the uncaused thing? That's like saying, okay, what's the name of the bachelor's wife? It's a category error because a bachelor is someone who's not married, so they don't have a spouse. Or to say, what does the color blue smell like? It just makes no sense. So even though on an elementary level it sounds like a good argument, it's not a good argument, yet he spent time in his book arguing, you guys got it all wrong because you can say God's the cause, but he needs a cause. So he wasted a lot of time. Here's his final summation is, it's an astonishing stroke of luck that we're here. It just happened. That's all they have. I mean, that's all they can have because they can't explain it with what they've got so far. But they will always say, just give us more time and we'll figure it all out. That's a faith position, by the way. When they say, we don't know, but just give us enough time and we will figure it out. They're doing the same thing they blame Christians for as having blind faith. That's a blind faith statement. God disagrees with Richard Dawkins because God's central argument in his book, Isaiah 40:26, says, to whom will you compare me? Or who is my equal, says the Holy One. Lift up your eyes and look to the heavens. Who created all these? He who brings out the starry host one by one and calls forth each of them by name. Because of his great power and mighty strength, not one of them is missing. God is telling us, look, the heavens declare who I am. And as we've just seen, none of us would be here if all those constants were not dialed in precisely. So, tonight we covered another argument for God. Next week we will cover there's the moral argument. We'll cover the last, or I should say, we covered the universe. We'll talk about the origin of life. So we will get into the problems with chemical evolution, because atheists, nobody started the whole show, so they have to figure out how chemicals and molecules, which have no intelligence, self-assembled to create life, and not just life, but intelligent life. So they have a lot of problems. They have to get life from non-life, consciousness from non-consciousness, and intelligence from non-intelligence. So that's what we'll discuss next week. Any questions? Man, I must be doing a fabulous job if nobody has questions. So.
Well, universe theory explains anything that it's supposed to explain, because it just, to me, looks like it makes more questions, it makes more.
Well, it doesn't ultimately solve the problem. For those online, Renee's question, they don't have the mic. Renee's question or comment was, she don't understand the multiverse doesn't really seem to explain anything. It just complicates the situation. That's very true. And it ultimately doesn't solve their problem, because if those other universes have certain parameters, they still have to explain those universes. So they do that a lot. They kick the can down the road. And yes, it does. It just causes it causes more problems for them. But you'll start to realize, and I don't want to belittle anybody, because a lot of these scientists are brilliant men. It's not like they're not smart people. They're a lot smarter than I am. The problem is, a lot of times, whether you believe in God is not just a logical proposition. There's a faith piece in that. Now, it's not, in my opinion, it's not a blind leap in the dark, but you can believe that God exists, but you have to believe in God. You have to place your faith in Him. And the problem is, a lot of times, they won't take that step because they've already convinced themselves ahead of time. Because our worldview, the way whether we have a biblical worldview or an atheistic worldview, we have to be careful, because our worldview is how we operate in the world, how we perceive the world, and we have to be careful that we are looking for truth wherever it may lead. And our worldview can color. When I went into my studies, who in here, when they went through their schooling, high school, and they were reading books and the teacher was teaching something, did you ever consider that, hey, what he's teaching me may not be true? I didn't. I just assumed everybody was giving me truth, so I just took it all. And then you start to realize, now wait a second, if I never expose my beliefs to alternate beliefs or something that's different from what I already believe, if I'm in deception, how would I ever get out of it? If all I do is feed myself, now I'm not saying you just abandon the Bible and you start reading all the atheist literature, I'm not saying that. But if all you ever do is say, this is what I believe, so I'm only going to consume all the stuff I already believe, if you're in deception in some area of truth, you would never know it, because you're piling on what you already believe. Because we would never tell Jehovah's Witnesses to not read outside stuff. And that's why they're held in the brainwashing, is because their superiors tell them, you only read our literature. We are the prophet of God. The Watchtower is the visible head of God on the earth, so you read only Watchtower literature. And as Christians, we'd look at that and say, don't do that. You need to read something that counters what you already believe. And yet a lot of times we as Christians do the same thing. So I don't think as a Christian that you should ever be afraid to listen, but listen critically to what somebody else is sharing with you. I would never kick a Jehovah's Witness off my porch just because it's an alternate doctrine from what I believe. Because if what you have is true, you can challenge it, and truth is truth. It'll hold up. Any other questions? If there's no other questions, thanks for coming out. If you do have questions, I'll stick around a while. So have a good evening.